So this is the final lecture in the wrist and the hand, and we're looking at the muscles. Now there's two sets of muscles like there were in the lower extremity, in the shank and the foot. There's extrinsic muscles, muscles that are in the forearm, and their tendons go down past the wrist into the hand and influence movement. And then you have intrinsic muscles, different layers. We'll be focusing mostly on the extrinsic muscles, primarily the big wrist flexors and extensors, which also then act as your ulnar and radial deviators. We'll do a quick discussion in the finger movements from the intrinsics, but we won't go much more than that. So when you see here, you see these different layers. You'll see like the superficial view of the musculature from an anterior view, more of a intermediate view, and a deep view. And I would say the majority of the forearm musculature is, you can see that the muscles here are originating. Some of them, this is brachioradialis. Some of these extensor or flexors cross the elbow, and so some of these wrist flexors and wrist extensors are actually weak elbow flexors. And most of these that are looking at the wrist kind of just cross the wrist and they attach here into the proximal end of the metacarpals. And then as you get into your deeper layers, like your Flexor Digitorum Superficialis or Flexor Digitorum Profundus, these are your primary finger flexors. And so the belly of the muscles here, they shoot down past the wrist, so they have an influence of wrist movement, but they can also go down and they control these distal or middle phalangeal joints. So your finger flexors, the bulk of your mass is actually there in your forearm. Same thing for the extensors and the extensor group. These extensors, most of them cross from the lateral epicondyle, and they come down and they extend the wrist and then extend the fingers. So here you can see extensor carpi radialis and longus and brevis, and both of these cross the elbow, and they have a weak influence over elbow flexion. So when you're doing a curl, you are sometimes training some of your wrist extensor muscles. So here's a cheat sheet for you to look at your wrist flexor group. You've got three muscles: Flexor carpi radialis, Palmaris longus, and then Flexor carpi ulnaris. And then you have your ECRL, ECRB, and Extensor carpi ulnaris here. So you have your Extensor carpi radialis longus, brevis, and that's your wrist extensor group. So pretty straightforward. For your finger muscles, your extrinsic finger muscles, you have on the anterior side, Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, Flexor Digitorum Profundus, and Flexor Pollicis Longus. These muscles cross the wrist, so not only do they influence the fingers, but they also influence the wrist. And same thing here with the posterior aspect. These are finger muscles, but they cross the wrist, so they also have an effect in wrist function as well. So here you can see the posterior muscle groups, and you can see that they're originating here on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. They're crossing the elbow joint, and they're coming down, and they are attaching to the wrist. If we were to, let me draw a line here. If we draw a line here, these are extensors, but then muscles on this side of the axis, these act as radial deviators. So extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor carpi radialis longus, and then extensor carpi ulnaris on the ulnar side, they're going to act as ulnar deviators. So if it has radius in its name, it's most likely going to do radial deviation. Ulnaris in its name, it's going to do ulnar deviation. And then when you look here on this hand here, the Flexor carpi ulnaris is going to do ulnar deviation, and the Flexor carpi radialis, because of the tendon over here, it's going to do, even though it's originating here on the medial epicondyle, its tendon shoots over on this side, and it's going to be a radial deviator. So pretty easy to kind of memorize those components, or at least have an understanding of that. Again, a redundant view. Here's the posterior view of the forearm, and you can see the extensor group. On the anterior side, you can see the flexor group, and then you can see pronator teres. That's there. Pronator quadratus would be here. And then this next slide kind of shows the, here's the contact point here, and you can see then ulnar deviation, flexion, radial deviation, and so forth. So you can see that the extrinsic finger muscles have influence over wrist movement. Here, Extensor Digitorum, for your finger extension. It is a pretty strong, it's got a pretty big moment arm for wrist extension. In fact, it's probably one of the more powerful wrist extenders. So when you do like a reverse curl or wrist extension, you are really engaging your extensor digitorum more than you're probably your extensor carpi or so forth. And then when you make a fist, what happens because of the length-tension relationship, so based on active and passive insufficiency, and we did this, let me just advance one slide. We examined in class grip position, and we looked at that your strongest grip is actually in this neutral position, and when you grip, and you grip as hard as you can, when you're gripping, you are producing finger flexion. But as you produce finger flexion, your wrist goes into extension. And so remember, the muscles that flex the fingers also flex the wrist. So if you look at this image here on the left, this is maximally shorting the finger flexors and at the wrist as well. So you're putting it into an actively insufficient position. Way over here on the right, if I go into full extension and then I try to grip, I am going into a lengthened position, and if you recall, our strongest muscular position is mid-range. And so what's happening is when we are gripping as hard as we can, we are shortening at the fingers, but then we want to lengthen back a little bit towards mid-range, so we're going to extend a little bit at the wrist. So I'll go back to the previous slide here, and that's what you're seeing here, is that for maximal grip strength, which is dependent upon the flexor muscles of the fingers, which the two big ones are Profundus and Superficialis, that in order to maintain mid-range of these muscles here, you would lengthen, since it's shortening at the fingers, you're lengthening at the wrist by producing wrist extension. So that's how that balance happens to maintain mid-range, so you're maximizing muscle participation. So now we're going to go through the individual muscles. We'll start with the flexors first. Your flexor carpi radialis. What you can see here, let me go a couple slides back, is that the extensors and the flexors have a common origination on the humerus. So the extensor groups all originate on the lateral epicondyle, and the flexors all originate on the medial epicondyle, and then from there they either stay on the ulnar side or they shoot over to the radial side, and same thing here. The extensors either stay on the radial side or they shoot over to the ulnar side. So flexor carpi radialis originates here at the medial epicondyle, and then it shoots straight down and attaches on the base of the metacarpals. And it is a wrist flexor and abductor or radial deviator. Palmaris longus, it's a muscle it's a weird muscle. It originates at the wrist, or at the common wrist attachment site, and it shoots down, and it kind of has then like all into the palm. And some people, this muscle is not present, and it's part of the general flexor group, but it kind of shoots into the hand. And if we were live in class, I would show you how you can make that pop out right in the middle of the wrist, and you can determine whether you have it or don't have it. Some people have it only on one arm. Most people have it on both arms, but it's one of those muscles that is not common to find. It's not uncommon to find someone that doesn't have it. And you can see here that it shoots into all of the into the aponeurosis of the palm and into the most of the hand. The last flexor muscle is flexor carpi ulnaris. So we had flexor carpi radialis, and now we're at the ulnar side. Again, it has the common attachment at the medial epicondyle, and then stays on the medial side and attaches onto the fifth digit here instead of over here. So it's a strong wrist flexor, and then it does ulnar deviation. So we flip sides and we go to the extensor group, and we have extensor carpi radialis longus. So if we have a longus, we're going to have a brevis. So these two muscles are going to be very similar. One's going to be longer, one's going to be shorter. That's the definition of longus and brevis. It originates on the lateral epicondyle, now on the posterior side, and shoots back. And since it's radialis, it's going to stay on this side a little bit, but it's going to go over to the into the ulna over here, into the base of the fifth metacarpal. So then the brevis here, it is going to be a little bit more towards the thumb side. So if we go back here, this extensor carpi radialis longus is actually going to be a it's going to be a ulnar deviator, whereas the brevis is going to be a radial deviator. So this is the one muscle. I had said earlier that generally on radials are going to go radial deviation. The extensor carpi radialis longus is that one exception because of its medial attachment to the fifth met. And then you're going to have extensor carpi ulnaris, which is going to be an ulnar extensor and an ulnar deviator. And then we get into the extrinsic muscles here, the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. This is going to be a wrist flexor and a finger flexor. And then you should have a profundus that's, again, wrist flexor and finger flexor. And then a Flexor Pollicis Longus, which is a muscle dedicated just to flexion of the thumb. Your Extensor Digitorum originates here in that same common extensor tendon, comes down and crosses the wrist, so it's a very powerful wrist extensor, and then it's your primary finger extensor. And then you have a group of muscles down here that are dedicated to that first finger and the thumb. And you have extensor pollicis brevis, extensor pollicis adductor pollicis longus, and then you have an extensor pollicis longus to go with the brevis, and then you have an extensor indicis, so you have one muscle that can straighten out or extend your finger. This is all in addition to extensor digitorum longus. So again, I just share this for general view. What I would really focus your attention on are, I don't have it in this lecture, but those the common flexor group and the common wrist extensor group, and then just detail out which one's an ulnar deviator and a radial deviator. And the only oddball is that extensor carpi longus. That is a extensor carpi radialis longus. It has radialis in the term, but it actually is an ulnar deviator. So from the extrinsic muscles, we have the intrinsic muscles, and there's quite a bit of complexity here. And I'm just going to go through this quickly, just as just an overview, but unlikely to appear on our test at this capacity. Really what we're looking at is wrist position and grip strength, and understanding that flexion versus extension, and maybe understanding a little bit that you have to do finger flexion versus wrist extension, but I would look more at the extrinsic muscles than the intrinsic. So you can see that here are the tendon sheaths that are coming through for the flexor digitorum. Here's the posterior end of the hand, and you can see the extensor sheaths. Oh no, this is flexor, just a deeper view. You can see that transverse carpal ligament. You can see that it's cut. This is the carpal tunnel, and then you can see in that tunnel those tendon sheaths from the flexor digitorum, profundus, and superficialis are shooting through. When we look even deeper, we get into the lumbricals and some of the adductor muscles. And again, everything is to be able to control each of these individual joints in the phalanges. Now we're looking at the posterior side of the hand, and you can see similar architecture with the muscle belly up here, and these long tendinous sheaths being shoot down to the distal phalanges. So then when you look at function, you can see how these wrist muscles are working together with the thumb and acting as ulnar deviators. In this case, a radial deviation followed by ulnar deviation to produce functional movements. And again, a similar image of the carpal tunnel, and you can see all the flexor and extensor tendons that are shooting through that area. And then the next two slides kind of show the finger, the extensor hoods, and these intrinsic muscles. But again, just for show, that there is a complex network of extrinsic and intrinsic relationship, so you can bend the finger at each joint. So whether you want to just isolate a flexion here, or flexion there. And again, a similar component. And that's it. So that completes Module 5 and from the wrist and hand.